curator, or artist curator, or artist/curator. I'm not really sure how to pronounce that. I'm very happy on the panel we have Charlotte Cullinan and Janine Richards, part of Cullinan Richards, artistic duo who spoke earlier today. We have Zarina Mohammed, who is a critic and one half of White Pube. And we have Jeremy Akerman, who's an artist, curator and publisher as well, with Akerman Daily. So I think all of them will be talking about parts of their practice and possibly making some statements, provocative or otherwise, about the nature of curating and artist roles within that. So would you like to go first? We haven't sorted out an order for this, but I'm basically just going to come towards me, I think.
Yeah, I'm just going to go through...
or is there an order up on your computer? Is there a way?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's alphabetical.
Is it alphabetical?
I don't know. It usually is. In the alphabet. Which
you should go first then, shouldn't you?
Well, that's right. I was always first on the register.
So I'm just going to talk a little bit about this show that we did in Dundee a couple of years ago, and talk about how the relationship of us as artists to the curator, Sophia Howe. And as we spoke this morning about this kind of idea that we produce work that can also be seen as support structures for other people's work, we've worked with Sophia Howe, the curator, for well now about 12 years now in different sorts of projects, and she invited us to make this show with her. She was very desperate to sort of show the work of the feminist artists from the 70s, a lot of them sadly who died quite young. So we're working with many artists who weren't alive anymore to re-show some of their sort of archives, which meant that we were actually producing the archives, reprinting, choosing kind of what scale-wise, what to kind of, what might be more dominant within the show. So we often use these structures made out of very simple scaffolding towers that you can buy in, they're builders' towers basically. So we use these very simple off-the-shelf structures to sort of renegotiate and reposition other artists' work. You can see in this image here the work of Susan here at the back, and the work of Linda Sterling, and she made these costumes for a dance performance. And I think I mentioned earlier today this kind of idea of where does painting live, and how to squeeze a painting in where it wasn't really kind of wanted. And so you can see one of our paintings that we managed to slide in, sitting in front of the structure behind the one in the front. The mirrors, the shelving systems were made with mirror, and so automatically shed this kind of light. It kind of threw the light, it reflected a lot of the artist's work, and it kind of threw the light around the room.
Can you say the name of the piece that happens?
I'll try to remember. So what we were trying to do was create a space in the middle of the gallery, because part of the 3-month exhibition had this thing called 12-Hour Action Group, which was a symposium which lasted 12 hours, with different artists presenting, and quite performative actually, so that the structures were sort of centred around what we call the circus ring. So a lot of the artworks were kind of reactivated in a way. Much of the stuff is quite archival. You can see quite a lot of magazines. There was slides by the Hackney Flashers. There was artworks by Alexis Hunter. There was artworks by an artist called Sue Williams that doesn't call herself an artist anymore. So we were kind of taking work out of these boxes of Sue Williams, for example, that had been in her bedroom for 40 years, that hadn't been seen, for 40 years, and she doesn't really sort of like think of them as artworks anymore, but they were actually the most popular amongst the young. You can see one on the right-hand side there. It's like knitted, kind of like bodysuit. So for us, it was tremendously exciting to discover other artists' work in this way. This is what we did for Linda's work, the work that she did when she was in a punk band. Some of the ephemera that we were showing here was extremely popular and extremely valuable stuff now, all these years later. Now, the title of the show is called Of Other Spaces, Where Does Gesture Become Event? And this is taken from Hannah Arendt's ideas around being human. So it had this very particular political quality that I think resonates very much now, coming from when she was writing in the middle of the 20th century. So it had these extraordinary sort of parallels socially and politically, this show. Most of the research was done by Sophia Howe. We worked with her for a long time before actually making the show with her. And it's what we want to say about that is that we are not curators ourselves. We're heavily reliant on the curators that we work with. This was a kind of hallway, and this was actually kind of adopted really in the end as an artwork of our own. But it was we were zooming up, choosing whether to reprint and reproduce material in colour, black and white. So the kind of resonance of what's kind of what you focus on, what the eye focuses on, or what the eye doesn't focus on, it was very important for us. This is, I didn't think this was particularly successful, this print, because it was digitally produced. And this is a Monica Ross artwork stuck on one of our structures. And so it has that kind of movie sort of thing that digital photography has, whereas the original would have been analogue. And there's a book that's just been produced by Sternberg called Of Other Spaces, Where Does Gesture Become Event? And it is a kind of record of the 12-hour action group. And within that, myself and Janine sort of presented the 12-hour action group through these notes that we wrote, which were kind of pre-notes that introduced each of the artists who partook in the show, but we did it in a kind of hypotext way. So we're not, as artists, we're not the ones who position the artist historically. We're the ones who kind of reposition the artist through a kind of flavour of the circus.
Kind of response?
As response, yeah, to their work. Okay, thanks.
So Zarina is going to present now. Thank you.
Oh, can I budge this? Or no worries if not. I'll just make that. Okay, hi. Stop laughing. Okay. Hi, as Jeremy said, yeah, I'm Zarina Mohammed. I'm one half of the White Pube, and I guess I have a little less to say about artists and curators and more to say about critics and their role in this all, because that's what I am. Although I formerly trained as an artist, kind of ended up being a critic by chance. So, I'm from the White Pube. We are at the White Pube on Twitter and Instagram, and our website is thewhitepube.com. This is what the website looks like vaguely. We've got, we normally publish a review every Sunday, either that or an art thought, which is kind of like a tiny little mini baby essay. They're getting less tiny though, they're getting longer and longer, which is, well, it's nice for me. And then this is our Instagram, and then our Twitter, and that kind of forms the holy trinity of our like critical practice. I think criticism does take place across all those different sites in very different ways. Like the Twitter is still a place for like critical discourse about art. It's just perhaps a bit less formal. The same for the Instagram. It's kind of, I think Instagram is where like most of my thoughts go to die, but like the stuff that ends up on the website is normally a bit more fully formed. And then I've got a little written bit, so I'm just going to read it to you as quickly as possible, because I'm aware that 10 minutes is not much time. But as artists and curators rethink historical and conventional forms of exhibition making, perhaps they are too close to see how their output is actually not as radical as the marketing copy claims it to be. Critics historically have been there to canonize artworks for the market or for art history, but the model of criticism that the White Pube wants to follow is one of support. What can criticism look like as a supportive, generous gesture? For artists as critical support, for curators as curatorial support, for viewers as contextual support. Like the world of theatre has dramaturgs, half inside, half outside, critics are capable of inhabiting space on a liminal threshold, a go-between or a translator. In asking about rethinking historical and conventional forms of exhibition making, several writers other than us are providing a critical backbone for the thinking and rethinking that's currently underway, as well as pushing for more than discourse and holding artists and institutions to account for not translating that discourse or language of change into action. And then, I don't think I have time for that, but I just wanted to like quickly kind of run through things that could perhaps kind of provide that that push towards accountability, kind of not just with us but with other people. But starting with the stuff we published, this is The Problem of Diaspora Art. This was a text that I published around this time last year about the problems with the way big institutions interact with artists of colour, the fact that it primarily takes place within the space of public programme that's fleeting, super underpaid and underfunded, yet like so rapidly churned out that it boosts up those diversity numbers for like core fund, for the funding bodies that like do actually kind of care or say that they want to care about diversity in the art world. All of that goes about in a way that kind of fosters a more visible change than like a rigorous change. And then Gabrielle published Do Galleries Ever Ask Us What We Want to See, which I quite like as a text, it's one of my faves, about the idea of local advisory boards and like what does locality look like within an arts institution that's say as big as Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, or I think it's worth a read. And then as a follow-up to The Problem of Diaspora Art, I followed this with The Problem with Representation. This was about, I guess, how there's a pervasive a neoliberal ideology of like, you know, that like the fundamental problem with multiculturalism is that it doesn't really acknowledge any difference at all, but rather like plays on the visible difference in like a happy kind of neutral space. It was kind of vaguely about that and the way that seeped into institutions as they move away from perhaps a more kind of traditional conservatism that's no longer fashionable. And then worth mentioning is Gemma Desai's The Arts Are in the Sunken Place, How Do We Get Out? This was published as part of her Claw Fellowship. I'm not sure it's actually published yet, but I think we did tweet a link to the Google Doc with her permission, so it is readable if you search quite hard for it. It's worth a read. I'm just going to read a little excerpt from it. Why does being a non-white, non-conforming worker in the cultural sector so often feel like being in the sunken place? like the protagonist in Get Out, I've got a feeling that something is off too. A feeling that despite everything my colleagues' Twitter feed and the newsletters landing in my inbox tell me, we are not in a moment of radical change in the arts sector. The sector is not in fact in a moment of self-inquiry and redress, but actually performing a monumental act of dissonance, upholding the same power structures as it always has, whilst performing a liberal set of behaviours that have become valuable not because of their meaning, but because of their cultural and marketable capital. And then following on from that, a few years ago actually, that was 2017, wild, time flies, but Morgan Quaintance published New Conservatism, Complicity and the UK Art World's Performance of Progression. A brief excerpt from that is, today, despite a passion for the vocabulary of change amongst those who populate the art world's upper echelons and a conceptual belief in rupture, paradigm shift and the turn, radical alteration of the field and the concrete cognitive institutions that compromise it, galleries, museums, art criticism, notions of best practice, etc., has not taken place. It is true, demographic gains have been made since the first few decades of the 20th century. However, the cost of limited access for people of colour, women and the working class, extracted through a subtle process of enculturation imperceptible to some, has frequently been the relinquishment of power. This state of affairs has facilitated a massive transference of power from artists to institutions, from the grassroots to the establishment, and from community groups to highly professionalised and inter-networked charitable organisations. The result in the UK is an art world whose only steady top-down movement seems increasingly to be towards the absorption and neutralisation of aberrant forces and the consolidation of its own regressive institutional influence over what may be considered art or legitimate arts-derived activity. And then to step back a little bit. Oh, hold on. Let me actually rest on that for a bit, because there's some stuff that has happened since I made this presentation a few weeks ago. In Gemma's essay, let me actually go back to it. In Gemma's essay, she mentions the appointment of Madani Yunus at the South Bank Centre, which happened, I think, earlier this year. She kind of points to that as a moment of like radical change within an institution that kind of has national importance. And she says, something along the lines of like, okay, that's actually really too long, but she basically points to it as a moment for like possible radical change to occur on a real monumental scale. But obviously Madani Yunus has now left the South Bank Centre in quite like a monumental shift. Like that was, it feels like a rupture or like a visible moment in which we can kind of hold an arts institution to account and say like, look, this is obviously fucking broken, it's not working. And Lynn Gardner wrote something really great for the stage, in which, I'm going to read a small excerpt from that as well. Am I talking too long? Is this over 10 minutes? Okay, cool. It is likely to fuel concerns that while many of the UK's biggest and best funded arts institutions are eager to talk loudly about increased diversity and the importance of being embedded in their community, they remain less willing to actually walk the walk when it comes to changing themselves, because real change isn't just cosmetic, it comes from within. In London, there is also a game-changing shift of demographics that art institutions, such as the South Bank, ignore at their peril. 57% of those under the age of 15 living in London are from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. And as well, it's worth noting that like within the space of London, in all age groups, there is actually a minority majority. Will those youngsters, more than half of the city's population, ever think that our cultural institutions have any relevance for them and their lives when our cultural workforces are so white? Just as Emma Rice's swift departure from Shakespeare's Globe threw up issues of entrenched interests versus the vision of an incoming artistic director, so Eunice's resignation highlights the fact that often arts organisations like the idea of making change until they discover that it might actually mean what it might actually really mean to implement it and who might have to step aside to ensure it happens. Speaking about Madani Yunus leaving the South Bank, I think it's also worth noting that some really great thought has happened from like young theatre makers and young arts writers kind of on Twitter informally and perhaps like outside the space of formal publications. So Toby Kiaramateng at Bobimono on Twitter wrote, Madani walking away from the South Bank is why representation politics is bullshit. Pulling in black and brown faces in seemingly positions of power without the emotional infrastructure to support radical work that isn't about maintaining power and upholding outdated structures. What's the point of encouraging black and brown people into these positions when as a sector we aren't willing to dismantle what leads leadership looks like under the gaze of whiteness. Orgs want to appoint black and brown faces as long as they are willing to uphold these structures. How many times have we been told change is more black and brown people in positions of power, but that must uphold whiteness, must not debate whiteness, must not act radically against whiteness, must battle whiteness at all levels of the organisation, and must be a ventriloquist and not an activist. Obviously, I cannot speak for Madani on the reasons he left, but what is clear as day is this sector runs on face value representation politics without actually doing the work of dismantling white supremacist ideologies our society and therefore our sectors have been built upon. And I think that, like, as a thread, was really kind of a really powerful and eloquent, really concise as well way of putting it. And I just wanted to mention that because I think that's like, just Twitter is like the best place to go for our thoughts, right? Like, but I think there are kind of moments of critical practice outside of this this discourse around the institution, and it's not necessarily always converged upon the institution as a site of, I don't know, problematic politics. Sometimes it's like the sector at large, and I think a really good example of this was Skye Arundhati Thomas's review of, or I guess write-up around the Venice Biennale, which she says, when the state and its institutions fail, it is art that takes on the burden of politics, and this is nowhere truer than in the representational infrastructure of the Venice Biennale. In these politically charged times, what feels missing is a vulnerability of process rather than of subject. In a powerful letter of protest against the American Whitney Biennale, two artists and a writer declared, now the highest aspiration of avowedly radical work is its own display. This holds true for all arts infrastructure, galleries, museums, public projects such as biennials. Representational infrastructure makes certain demands of its work, and no matter the political promise of the work on display, it is difficult for this not to get co-opted. While the biennial ensures that visitors are able to survey a wide range of representations, it is in fact the representational aesthetic that we must dispute. This is especially true of the National Pavilion model, considering especially the global death of the nation-state. Also worth recommending, like as recommended reading, is Hannah Black, Kieran Finlayson and Toby Haslett's text, The Tear Gas Biennial, a call to boycott the 2019 Whitney Biennial because of the presence of Warren Canders on the biennial board and his company Safariland, which is basically an arms company that, amongst other things, deals arms and counterinsurgency equipment to the IDF, the US Customs and Border Protection, and the police forces in Baltimore and Ferguson, Missouri. Oh, and around that text, Canders did resign from the biennial board. I'm just going to end with this thought from Morgan Quaintance and that text on New Conservatism. Despite protestations that the pervasive and an inescapable reach of neoliberal capitalism has created an existential framework in which compromise and complicity are the new original sins, I suspect silence, resignation, or apathy are fueled by something far more basic: comfort. Put simply, people are adverse to personal risk and lifestyle change. If radical progression and a separation of art from systems adversely affecting people across London and the rest of the United Kingdom is to stand a chance, then it has to start with a reclamation of agency from actors who have been conditioned to believe that they do not have any. Replace, or at the very least, augment the impulse to engage and reform with a robust effort to withdraw and rebuild. And with that thought, I guess I want to kind of posit the idea that if we are to really kind of overthrow, or maybe not overthrow, maybe in like a softer term, rethink the historical and conventional forms of exhibition making, maybe people need to start resigning. Maybe institutions do actually need to be dismantled. Maybe we turn the Tate Modern into a soft play centre, I don't know. But like, I think if we're talking about rigorous rethinking, perhaps it's not enough to reform, maybe it is worth starting from scratch. Thank you.
Thanks, Zarina, that was great. Tons there. How to follow it? Right. I hope I won't seem too anachronistic, old-fashioned, but I'll have a go. Where is the artist curator now? That's my first thought. I've been chewing on the title for this panel for a few days, and it only strikes me today what is strange about it, which is that the role of the artist curator in rethinking conventions is not something I associate with New Contemporaries one bit. I like the idea that someone might apply to New Contemporaries with an idea for how to show all the other works, but I can't really see how that would fly under the current model. However, if New Contemporaries did open up to curatorial proposals, it could be interesting. I'm not saying it has to, I'm not, no pressure, it's not like that, but models of curatorial excellence or curatorial difference are not so readily available in our conventional times. So this seems like a good opportunity. I'm thoughtful, if not sceptical, about the hybrid entity called the artist curator. The fusion of the two activities into one isn't possible. No, I think it is possible, but it does feel schizophrenic to be both inside the artist and outside the artist the curator simultaneously. More likely is the ability to operate as an artist at one time and as a curator at another in distinct phases. This seems plausible. Perhaps more plausible still is that someone with an artistic sensibility can actually organise a piss-up in a brewery. The artist curator group par excellence for this was Bank, back in the 90s and noughties. I haven't seen anything quite like them since, nothing quite so challenging or nothing quite so scary to work next to as a young curator as I did. So I miss them. The artist curator seems like a subversive title, or it once did, I think, but now it feels rather tame. Of course, there's always the whiff of the artist being able to sprinkle some magic art dust into dull curatorial proceedings. I think I'm suspicious about the way that the artist curator is used. But anyway, I'm getting cynical, perhaps. What's the motivation for an artist curator? Aren't there enough curators everywhere now? Enough for one per artist? Well, it's true. There are a great number of curators graduating each year, and there's lots of artists graduating too. But the motivation to me remains the same: having a voice, being part of a decision-making, influencing ideas, expressing ideas in public spaces, getting ideas into print, into history, getting paid. So it still sounds good. But the world is huge, and the term artist curator is a very general term, and I have found I need to be so much more specific about it. The work I do with Akerman daily, here's our homepage, has always been all about the writing of artists. But that very specific area has narrowed recently to being more about poetry by artists, and now poetry by women artists. And the more specific we get, the clearer the message seems to get. So I think that's my thought on that. My own reasons for putting on a curator's hat from being a good art student boy were that as a postgrad student, I was irritated by the usual parade of tutors invited in. I felt we needed more examples of recent graduates to come and say how they're getting on, not just celebrities rerunning greatest hits. My head of department then was a chap called John Thompson, not the John Thompson from this weekend, but another one, now dead, himself, a veteran artist, curator, writer of two hugely influential exhibitions at the Hayward. And he responded to my irritations, complaints, by asking me to write down my ideas, and then muttered words about seeing if he could find a budget. That, in a nutshell, was my training for curating. Get a budget, write out a program of events, and take responsibility for seeing it through. I was over desperate in those days to put a kink in convention, and had lists of annoying ideas to change the game, like an exhibition where no works were allowed on the existing walls, or installing a large central stage that meant any viewer had to climb on it to see the works from a raised level and then become a kind of performing work themselves, and the occlusion of performance works, for instance, that just disrupted things, and so on. I recall taking ideas like this and lists of artist names to show to Greg Hilty at the Hayward, thinking, oh, maybe I can get a big show and be a big curator. They weren't interested in my attempts to be a convention upsetter, or in the amazing collage work of Tarek Alvi that showed too many naked stiffies or the idealised political messaging in early Chad McHale that now finds so many echoes in the Extinction Rebellion campaign. For a while I was like a travelling salesman of art, trying to find a host body to take me in. Jimmy Durham was a wonderful influence and support. He let me publish some of his writing, and he crystallised ideas to me about turf and territory, what he calls a place to stand. So when I think about the where now question for the artist curator, I think of Jimmy saying, I'm sure I could address the entire world if only I had a place to stand. You Americans have made everything your turf. There is a problem with space. How to get it, how to grow in it, how to argue the case for it, how to get a grant from the Arts Council, how to get paid for the work. The problem or question is actually the same for the artist or the curator. What do I care about? What should I do? What can I do? This question never goes away. So here's my list for the where next bit of the question in the panel discussion for the artist curator. Right. Should maybe drink some water. One, take the unlikely road. This is difficult. Often people need a personal crisis or complete breakdown in their career trajectory to actually do this. I've had a few, so I've been lucky about finding myself on unlikely roads or in unlikely situations. About 15 years ago, I met up with Eileen Daly to talk about a book of artist fiction stories, and I had little expectation about her idea at that time. But within our first meeting, it was as though we'd spotted land, and to our amazement, there was space for us on it, and a lot of possibilities opened up from that. Don't work alone. It's really exciting to work alone for a while, and you can make all the mistakes and enjoy all the glory, but it soon gets horribly lonely, and you have to have someone to exchange ideas with and to do the writing with. Most of curating is writing in the office and office work, so better to have someone to share that with. Number 3, find out what you really care about and do that. This is sort of easy to begin with, but gets muddy over time, so it needs reappraisal every so often. An example of doing something essential that I believe that Eileen and I stumbled on was to offer writing courses for artists, to offer to teach artists in simple steps over a couple of days how to use their writing more effectively and to write better. A really simple, get-it kind of idea that produces amazing results. Other obvious ideas are support artists. Offer them a space. Akerman Daly offers artists a space to make and show their writing art online and give them feedback and opinion. Conventions persist because they're not properly criticised or held to account. Where is the useful feedback and critique for the artist and curator? And have courage. Have proper discussions about form and technique. The reason so many exhibitions look the way they do is because of MDF and white paint rather than the art. I'm saying that, to be a bit shit-stirring because it's the end of the day, but because I half believe it's true. And final thoughts are that Arts Council could run more programmes for the would-be artist curator, and they need to be nationwide and not London-based. It used to be something they did more of, and they were fraught with problems and they were tricky, but they were good, and they should try again. So I end as I started. Maybe there is a model for the artist curator that New Contemporaries could pioneer. Thank you.
I'm happy to go to questions from the audience if you have some. I've got a few questions myself, so I can kick it off if you want. But if anyone's got a burning question. No. Absolute deathly silent.
Where's the bar? That's the burning question, surely.
That's the question. How much longer?
Can I ask just, Zarina, could you please explain about the South Bank Centre?
Oh, right.
Thank you.
I mean, I'm by no means an expert on what happened, and
just say the names again. I didn't get any.
Oh, right. Okay. So I think 10 months ago, Madani Yunus was appointed artistic director at the South Bank Centre. The previous role had been, the person in the role previous to him had been under the title of creative director, I think. So the title changed. before he was at South Bank Centre, I think he was at the Bush Theatre, and he kind of did some really incredible, really radical work, kind of turning it into an arts organisation that had real connection to the local community and supported emerging artists and emerging writers, but also kind of put on stuff on the main stage that had national importance, which, at least in my mind, is that's the ideal. That's all I kind of ask for as a critic, just some vague kind of awareness of where you are. So then he went to the South Bank, and I think 10 months in, the idea that you'd be forced to leave, or that you'd feel the need to leave, without kind of being 10 months is not enough time, anywhere near enough time to embark on the radical changes that I imagine he spoke about during the really intensive, I imagine quite rigorous interview process, and that by no means enough time for the South Bank to expect any of that to happen. So something must have gone wrong, and like Toby said, we can't really,
Okay, thank you. I just didn't hear who it was.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Was.
No, of course.
Thank you.
No worries.
Right, I'm going to take control. Maybe you start with Cullinan Richards. Could you talk? You said that there was you were dependent upon Sophia Howe's curating. I just wondered if you could talk a little about how that relationship was sort of established, or how it developed. Was it clear from the beginning about what your role was, or was there a vagueness which then was consolidated in a way, or how did it work?
Yeah, I think she had started talking to us about the exhibition really early on in her thinking. She didn't ever, I think that's what we were trying to sort of say, that we were positioned somewhere in between the artists and the curator. We didn't curate the show, but what we are invited to do was be involved in how the audience comes to the work, which was really interesting, and it was we were really grateful to her for letting us do it, because we're really interested in that. Whether that is what that is, I don't know, but we've never really considered ourselves to be curators, and I think that we really enjoy working with curators. But it's very it's interesting for us as artists to be allowed to work in that way. So she was she wanted us to design these support structures to hold up the work, to make the it's like a physical structure for the show, but we're not exhibition designers either. So the work has a name that is sort of like a sculpture that operates in this way of supporting the artworks, and also, but she was also very involved in that too. And then this also very rematerializing of aspects of the archives that were not actually there anymore. So things that were unshareable, that were just photographs of magazine articles or piece of writing, or that had to be reprinted in some way and made again. That's really interesting. That was really, really interesting for us to
really
make those
fascinated
aesthetic decisions.
by that kind of activity. I did a little bit of that with Donald Rodney's work at one point, and then I got involved in a remake for Richard Hamilton at Tate, where they remade these first installation from photos, or rather, I made it, and you get paid, and then they sell the piece to the Sofa Reina gallery as if it's the piece, and it's amazingly fraught and curious world about what's real and what's not real,
I think that also brings up maybe something that was very poignant for us, because it was it was all women's work, and a lot of it had been very badly stored, wasn't looked after at all. There were sometimes totally no nice crates and condition checking, or any money had been spent really on, and a lot of several of the artists had obviously just stopped making work for those reasons, that they just couldn't get the support for the work, and that was actually really sad to see really, really talented, brilliant artists who were extremely influential and important just sort of end up with a cardboard box under their bed, just trying to hold on to the remnants of what they'd done. And
I think fraught is a very good way to describe it, actually.
And it's a heartbreaking thing, and I think you find it a lot. The more you're involved with the art world, you find, I mean, what happens to those artists who were super famous then just disappeared, and if they don't carry on or get some kind of other little niche to be in, they're just people, they live here or they live there.
And a lot of it's very specific for women artists, that they are not, they don't have the legacy, they're not historicised, they're not necessarily written about or in a support system that means that they can be visible or even rediscovered. So it was
especially in the rush to rehabilitate certain parts of art history.
I just wonder if I could ask you, Zarina, about, you talked about agency really and power, and who has power and how it can be used. And as somebody, as Kirsty said, I'm currently running the writing program at the Royal College, and have to sort of trick people that it's actually a worthwhile thing to do in order to maintain student numbers, etc. It's interesting that you're sort of claiming the critic as having quite a bit of agency in comparison to the curator or something. And I just wonder if you could talk about that, because that feels counterintuitive. It's a really interesting point, because I think the way that histories are normally, the history of these sort of supplementary roles is thought about is that the critic is dead, effectively. The critics had these very powerful roles in the 60s, 50s. You think of Greenberg and people like that, Sontag, who'd changed opinions about everything. And now we don't have those sort of roles, but we have curators who do that. The curator has become the most powerful person within the art world. Well, they're the superstar. You have superstar curators, but you don't have superstar critics. I mean, apart from you, obviously. Just get that straight. So, but it's interesting. But I think that's what's interesting about what you've done, is that you've actually claimed that mantle. We are going to be like superstar critics, or we are going to create this sort of agency or position, whereas most writers or critics don't do that. So I just wondered why you think there's a role for that, or it's possible to do that.
I mean, I think a large part of it is the idea that we as the White Pube are independent. That's a huge kind of power grab for us, at least. Two women who one of us, obviously a Muslim woman of colour, and Gabrielle is a working class northerner. These are not voices that traditionally would have the space to write from our subjectivities within the space of a normal kind of traditional magazine structure, or even any other publication that exists now, without kind of having to deal with or handle an element of tokenism. So the idea that we're independent, no public funding, we're funded directly by our readers, or weird moments like this where I'm paid to talk about what I do rather than do what I do. That's the only funding that goes in. So in my mind, I'm that's power, right? That's really tangible, solid power. I can say whatever I want, and no one's going to kind of hold me to account in any kind of real way.
Yes.
You can try. I mean, the idea of a superstar critic is really bum clenchy cringy to me, because I don't know about changing taste in that way. I think it's
but you did say earlier about holding people to account, holding galleries to account and things like that. So I mean, that's you know, it might not be like an old-fashioned, like, aesthete type changing taste, but it is about affecting change in the world.
Yeah, I think it's a more kind of tangible way of like affecting change though, because like changing taste is so ephemeral. It's so like this like abstract philosophical thing. Whereas I think, I mean, I don't know, the way that our writing gets absorbed by our readers and like by institutions might be a little different to how we intended to. But in my mind, at least, we're writing very solid things. Like we're writing tangible, solid, real ways that the art world can change for the better. Whether anyone listens to us or not is, you know, out of my hands. I can't really change anything there. But I think, yeah, in my mind at least, critics are really well positioned. It's not just us, it's like, yeah, people like Morgan and Sky are, and, you know, Gemma's not a critic. Gemma's, I think, a film curator at the BFI, I think. But, you know, as a writer, she's got a real ability to affect and demand change and kind of create conditions where not really bending to that kind of looks worse. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any questions now? Yeah, there's one up out there. Thank you.
I was saying it's been a really your talk was amazing. I really thank you for like drawing attention to that issue and all those issues bound up there. But also I'm just interested in my own practice. But all the panelists, what your like interpretation of an exhibition designer is opposed to a curator. I think in the UK, like exhibition design is very much an othered form of practice that's like hidden. Whereas in like Germany, exhibition designers are far more active. I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts on that?
Actually, I had a thought. Is that okay if I talk? Sorry. I mean, something that you were saying really in a way about your role, and I sort of wonder whether, you know, in some way I think the visual art world likes to think of itself as being fantastically sophisticated and intelligent, and in so many ways it so isn't. It's so lacking, and it's so conservative, it's so lacking in so many different types of roles, and I think one of them is this role between things. A couple of weeks ago, for example, I got in a Twitter beef with Alex Needham. I'm always in Twitter beefs, it seems, because he tweeted something ridiculous. He obviously, Curator had just pissed him off, and he said something like, if curators think that they're going to get name-checked in the reviews, they've got another thing coming, or something like that, to that effect. And I just asked him, are you going to mention continue to mention conductors in your reviews of classical music concerts? And he said, well, yeah, of course I am. And it was just this question of like, well, why are certain roles mentioned and some aren't? Lots of people then defended curators in a way which I thought was equally stupid. But it was interesting. I pulled up that in the latest theatre review that they had on the Guardian website, they mentioned the playwright, the director, obviously the three main actors, the lighting designer, the set designer, and somebody else as well. So he was sort of saying there wasn't enough space to mention a curator, but they mentioned actually 5 or 6 backroom people as well as the 2 stars. And it did make me think that in a way where the scenography is sort of what you were doing. And I can remember there was a show that Maria Lind did, I don't know where we saw it together actually, in Stockholm. And the scenography, it had scenography by Liam Gillick. And that was an interesting thing because Maria had curated it, but Liam had sort of designed it, but it was more than just design. He was actually involved in the thinking of the show and how it was presented, so he sort of stood between them. And I just wonder whether we do need to expand our language within the visual arts, because the curator seems to cover so many things now, and you know, and now curator has just become sort of the most overused word in English language anyway. You know, people curate their sort of shampoo collection or something.
The reason I mention it is because coming from that last speaking, so I can't remember your name, you may have mentioned why lots of exhibitions look the same because they're made from white paint and yeah, like.
Oh, I got you with that. That went home that time. Good.
That limited vocabulary.
Yes. Well, my response to you is if you're interested in being an artist curator or curating at all, then skill up. And it's not difficult. You know, learn how to cut up bits of wood and stick them together. Learn how to paint them. There is a very, very basic kind of problem within a lot of public spaces, galleries, institutions in in the UK, which is a kind of class problem, I think, which is that you've got the technicians on one level. I think it exists in art schools as well, where you've got the technicians in one level and the tutors on another, and you've got the curators and the technicians. And for a long time, to make money, I worked as a technician, and I encountered a lot of kind of, derogatory comments because I'd got ideas about how the exhibition should look better. Now, when I worked at the Tate on a remake, helping them remake that Richard Hamilton bloody retrospective nonsense, I was treated like a technician again. It was like unbelievable. I just remade this piece from a photograph. Who else can do that? So I get quite annoyed with the curator for not understanding stuff. Obviously, Jeremy, the other Jeremy, that is right insofar as that the curator has to cover too many bases and it's just a general management role, really. I mean, that's what I prefer the word organizer to curator because I think that more accurately describes the job. So I think, but the problem is, why do things look like they do? Well, because that's what people expect, or because they haven't thought, oh, well, everybody's got that, and that's the right way to do it. And then we're just talking about fashion, really, aren't we? Okay, here's this fashion sweeps in, and this fashion sweeps out, and it's got this kind of look. And of course, the trouble with looking back over the history of exhibitions making, is that it's like, there's so many exciting examples of all kinds of interruption, radical changes, directions people have taken, and then you get to the Tate and you think, what, really? Just going to put it on the wall and maybe go around the edges. So, disappointing and lots of space for improvement.
Can I just quickly add something? I think we're a bit cheaper as well. Artists are cheaper than designers. I was looking at a job description recently and I thought there's no way we could be exhibition designers. You have to do all sorts of things on CAD and all the rest of it. And so it's that for starters, is the huge difference. And I think the other thing I'll say about the show we did in Dundee, well, this is kind of relationship that artists have with each other, which was very valuable. And it's kind of different to the relationship you might have artist to curator. And I think that was quite key to working with more or less 36 different artists, that in the end it would be artist to artist how their work would be presented.
Yes.
I don't know why in this panels I started with the second one that we are talking about curator as an organizer and motivator, which is absolutely a misunderstanding of the profession in my opinion. Because I think that especially nowadays, like curators are the ones that really works with culture, they are engaged with philosophy, they are engaged with analysis and of the society in general. So I don't see the point for them organizer, because it's really like the last piece. I work for a museum in Italy, that is in Castello di Livoli, so I work with Karen Christopher and Marcella Beccaria, which has totally two different way of creating. One is more with philosophy, and the other is more an art historian. And what we were doing is we was really like sometimes explaining and make art more accessible to the public through all the text, the catalog, which is a big part of the curatorial works, which is not organizing. And on the other hand, it was really like even in all this, like, sometimes contradictory way that always happen in the hierarchy of artwork, because at the end there's also, we talk about the equality and so on, but that's also this point. But anyway, on the philosophical level and the way they do culture is really shaping things around and say something. Otherwise, we're like gonna take art as art itself, like an object, while when you place something in a space and you placements one next to the other is creating meanings, and an organizer doesn't create meanings if there's a second level. So yeah, just, I don't know, if you want us to respond to that, I would be happy, otherwise it's just my comment.
I mean, oh sorry, if no one else, I'll, I think I disagree quite a lot with that statement, because I think, I mean, the question before as well feels like it's really related to that, like the idea that like curatorial practices engage with, curatorial practices, I guess, like have one kind of fundamental meaning that like excludes design or like organisation as like a thing. In my mind, feels like something that Morgan kind of spoke about in his text. The idea that like there's one way to curate, and it involves like these heavy kind of abstract concepts, and but also like making things accessible and like trying to translate it. And I think in that sense, sometimes curators, as we know them, they end up being like jack of all trades, master of none. Like they're just spread way too thin to like do anything with any kind of commitment. There's no specificity within that. It's just way too abstract and concerned with the abstract. And like I think the root of that can be found in the fact that like so many curators, you know, independent or embedded within institutions, like, you know, at least within the UK, so many of them come from like a handful of London art schools, like the RCA, or like, you know, Goldsmiths, or, you know, maybe even the Courtauld. Like if they come from these places and they're being taught that curation is this specific thing that happens this specific way, like I don't know, like the diversity of thought in the field feels like it's just, that is a shallow interpretation for me of like what curation can have the possibility to include. I think maybe a good reference is my other half, Gabrielle, who is based up in Liverpool. She calls herself gallery manager of a local, kind of hyper-local, she calls it, gallery called Output. It's just like off the main high street in Liverpool, and it only shows work by artists born or based in Merseyside. And I think in calling herself gallery manager, it kind of leans into this idea that like her role can contain something more organisational and leave the philosophical or theoretical abstract aspects to the artists themselves, or, you know, for them to engage with how they want, when they want. And it's just as a model for, like, you know, I mean, it's not even calling itself a curatorial model, but like as a model for putting on exhibitions, it's completely different to say someone like Cedric Falk, whose curatorial practice is incredible, like kind of works on such an incredible, like it's such a fine-tuned thing, but it's so different to Gabrielle's practice in that sense. And they're both kind of equally as valid and do a similar thing in putting on exhibitions, but yeah. So I disagree, sorry.
Got more questions, Jeff?
I think it might be the last one. Is that okay?
Got one at the back and then one
is
there.
it? So who was the first one I missed?
The chap in the back corner.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to say, this comes up a lot when you go to talk about artists and then curators, or and vice versa, where there's a potentially a passion profession. No one really likes the term curator too much now. You should be really careful about having a go at it. It's just as valuable as everyone else in that ecology. But what we could certainly all agree on, I think, is there's a toxicity related to that role now. Probably because it's been absorbed by advertising and other sectors, but also maybe just because the power and the money is not fair. And maybe there's a sense, you know, we always get angry with the one we feel is sort of getting a better deal with us. And that maybe, you know, we talk about not mentioning the curator before mentioning them in the show. You should always reflect everyone's participation, of course, especially if they've been important. But it does, I get the sense that a lot of the conversation today with curators, there's a sense that maybe there's a bit too much power in institutional curating, maybe it's not reflective of the diversity for sure. Certainly as well, the curator fees are always guaranteed, or maybe always guaranteed on an institutional level, maybe not so much for the collective or the collaborations with artists, and so forth. And I think a lot of this sort of bashing that we get from, you know, the curator is because it's been quite good as a profession at securing money, securing position of power.
Thank you.
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? Because you've got to keep your organisation going, and everybody who enters into that particular game of application for money quickly learns to look at how other people are working that game and what tricks are they, how do their letters, applications differ from yours? What's the best way to, is it crowdfunding? Is it, asking the relatives of the artist? Is it what way? It's endless amounts of endeavour and intrepid ways to be involved in this, and I don't think I'm bashing, is what I'm trying to say. I'm just trying to say, if the question is where next or how do you do something different, then I think simple things like calling yourself the art manager are really excellent solutions. Just think sideways. It doesn't mean that you have to have it in for the curator or the artist or the funder or just think laterally, think where the space is, think, is it really interesting for me to do this or not? I'm just think that in that funding caravan, you just get swept up with it, and then years down the line you find yourself writing these application forms that you don't believe in, and it's a bad place to get. So I say that as somebody who's got to that place and pulled back from it.
Maybe it's maybe what's required is actually a bit more specificity about these terms as well. We go back to a curator being a person who looks after a collection, and we start talking about producers. I mean, there was a lot of talk in the 90s about the curator as producer, and that's sort of what we now mean by curators, really, is people who produce commission work and have the ideas and do all of this. And I think this is maybe one of the issues, is that most of my time that I spent as a curator was organising things. I mean, basically, if things aren't organised, they're disorganised. That, you have one or the other. So most of your time is spent, whether it's organising ideas or people or crates, you're putting things in relation to each other, which has meaning. That's how things are organised. That's how meaning is organised and created. So maybe some of these big terms need to actually be split up a bit more, and we sort of start talking about what it is that we want to do within those roles. There was one more question, and then we'll stop. Is that okay?
It was there.
We're over. Right. Focal question. There was just this lady here in the middle. Yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to know your opinions about this. If you're aware, the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna, they did a few exhibitions with celebrities like Pamuk, Edmund Laval, and latest there was Anderson. And I don't see anything like that happening in this country. And the other thing is, for the winter 15th, this artist collective is going to create. And I just wanted to get your opinions about, do you think it's just for the sake of celebrity names, crowd attraction, or it's a kind of new thing which has to be introduced everywhere? Why it's not happening in this country?
Celebrity curators.
Well, I'll just say something about the fact that there's been a group invited to do the next documenta. I think it's highly politically dodgy. I think I read this article that I think it's 3, isn't it? 3 of them. I think they're going to find it really difficult. They're going to be divided. And they're not going to get paid as much as one person will get paid. And then there's all sorts of complications about that, and the history of documenta and the local money and how it's all funded. I think it's going to be very problematic.
Okay.
It's the Live Aid problem.
Right. Thank you very much. I'd just like to thank Charlotte, Janine, Zarina, and Jeremy for taking part in the panel. Thank you.
Thanks to all of our participants today, and particularly to Janine and Charlotte for stepping into this last panel. Ryan, unfortunately, couldn't join us because he was ill today. So, next door, drinks and Patrick Cole's performance. Brilliant. Thank you very much.